Okay, welcome back to BPM 232, Buddhist Psychologies. And this is lecture 8. We're following on from the last lecture, which was on psychological contextualism. And this lecture is going to extend many of those concepts and touch, primarily speaking, on the concept of dependent co-origination. So, the first thing to know about dependent co-origination, okay, is that it emerges squarely from the second noble truth. Okay, in a sense, okay, it is the heart of the second noble truth, is the notion of dependent co-origination. And the second noble truth isn't a theory, right? In the way that we might normally think about a theory. Rather, it's a process that we are immersed in, a process that we're entangled in. Okay, so the idea that that the issue of tanha, right, of craving, of thirst, right, is the cause of our suffering, right, and that ignorance and this tangling are what produce this, is what the second noble truth is concerned with, and it lays out a particular kind of process. Okay, another way to think about this is that the word samsara, right, sometimes gets used to mean world, okay? But properly speaking, really it's like process, right? So samsara isn't a place, right? We're trapped in samsara, but samsara isn't a place. It's a process. It's not a place that we are. It's a cyclical process that we find ourselves trapped in, okay? So when the second noble truth lays this out, not as a theory, but as a process that we're immersed and entangled in, it's the core, okay, of right understanding. It's the core of right view. So when we're looking at the Eight Noble Truths, the notion of right understanding, the notion of right view is a view of this very thing, okay? In a sense, it's the beginning of the Eightfold Path, right? It's the beginning of the Eightfold Path, because once you have a sense of this cycle, of this entanglement, right, you understand your predicament. This cycle, this entanglement, this process that we are caught in is the problem. That's what causes our issue. Now, consequently, right, you start to get a sense of this process. And of course, the understanding is that if you could just disrupt this process in some way, if you could stop it, if you could keep, right, if you could intervene in some way and break this process, you would be free, right? You would be free from the entanglement. And that's correct. So it has been said, okay, among other things, that once you kind of grasp the notion of dependent co-origination, once you grasp the basic notion of codependent origination and internalize it, it gives you the space, in some sense, for kind of a wiser, better life. When you learn to see everything in this way, right, you've got the key to the Dharma. You've got the key to the Dharma. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about notions of dependent co-origination. So partly the aspect of it, of course, is that it, it shows that everything is interconnected, right? It shows that nothing stands on its own. Now, also, obviously, that is part of kind of the question of impermanence, right? Nothing is solid and permanent and set apart. Everything is connected. Everything is connected. Everything is dependent on each other, right? Everything is caught in a webwork of cause and effect, and nothing stands alone. It stands apart. And that includes us, right? We are part of the system. We are not alone. We are not separate. None of us stand apart, right? Although we typically think we do and we want to, right? So we think of ourselves as unmoved movers, right? We think of ourselves as originators of action. We think of ourselves as, right, often sort of perpetual beings, or at least we want to be, right? And we want the things that we are attached to likewise to stay perpetual. But in fact, we too are part of this process, okay? So I want to talk a little bit about the sort of structure, okay, of dependent co-origination. And really specifically, I want to talk about the so-called 12 links. So this is the traditional formulation. When the Buddha formulates it, he's formulates 12 links to this process. And as you'll see, there's a cyclical aspect. Now, it is a bit confusing because the order in which the Buddha described the 12 steps is not, in fact, the order in which they occur causally. So that's a bit confusing, and I will try to lay that out for you as best as possible. There are some speculations on why he numbered them the way that he did, despite the fact that they don't actually go totally in that order. Okay, and I'm going to propose some other potential explanations, but we're going to look at kind of the 12 links. We're going to go through the 12 links a little bit and get some sort of diagrammatic sense of it, right? And then also I want to sort of connect that through and talk a little bit about how that connects in a sense to sort of Western practice, which is to say, how does it connect to things like therapy, right? Like traditional therapy in the West. And what does it mean? How do these processes relate to each other? How do they reflect each other? And what does all of that potentially sort of mean? How do those two things integrate with each other to inform a kind of pathway? Okay, so the 12 links of dependent co-origination, okay, are very distinct. I'm going to list them off, but then I'll also give you a diagram that shows them. So the listed 12 links traditionally are ignorance. I don't have 12 fingers, so this is going to be tricky. Ignorance, mental formations, consciousness, name and form, the 6 sense organs, contact, feeling, craving, clinging, becoming, birth, and aging and death. That's the 12. You can slow me down to half speed, I guess, and record that, or you can just wait for me to pop the diagram up. Maybe I will do that right now. In fact, that will make everyone's life easier. Okay, here we go. So here is a relatively traditional diagrammatic version of this, okay? So you can see, right, we begin in ignorance, mental formations, consciousness, mind and matter, which is what I refer to as name and form, the 6 senses, contact, feeling, craving, attachment, written here, I said clinging, right? Becoming, birth, aging, and death. And you can already see that there is some separation between the nature of these things, right? Past causes, present effects, present causes, future effects. Now, what I want to say quickly in this respect is that it's a little bit confusing because the order of operations, okay, the actual order of operations when you are kind of going through this process goes like this. Step 1, 2, 3, okay. Step craving and clinging, 8 and 9, okay. And then steps 4, 5, 6, and 7, right? And then 10, 11, 12, becoming, death, aging, right? Confusing. You can see that those separations are somewhat reflected here, although not perfectly reflected. We get this transition. Now, I'm going to unpack each of these things. So take it down. Ignorance, mental formations, consciousness, mind and matter, 6 senses, contact, feeling, craving, attachment, becoming, birth, aging, and death. This order that we see is the order that the Buddha originally presented this in, but not the order that it has been interpreted to actually go when we're dealing with it as a process. Now, when I say that it's a process, what do I mean? I mean specifically that it's a mental process. This is the process by which, right, craving and the karmic cycle are perpetuated. And you can see that somewhat because, as I said off the bat, right, samsara sometimes is translated as the world or process, but often it's specifically associated with karma, right, with the turning of the wheel of karma. And so this, 12 link system, this loop, right, is in some sense what generates karma, which we can, of course, interpret in a multi-layer fashion, but also we can just look at it as how it is endlessly rebirthing us back into, frankly, our nonsense, right? So it's endlessly rebirthing us back into our nonsense. Now, it's probably useful if we kind of go through, and I should say, like, there is a lot of interpretation around these things, right? Despite the fact that this is a central doctrine, right, within Buddhisms, despite the fact that it's a central doctrine within Buddhisms, it is frankly fairly contested in terms of its interpretation. If you look at different teachers and you look at different schools, different branches of Buddhism, right, you are going to find distinct interpretations. So one of the interpretation, right, that one of the sort of splits that you will see in the interpretation of this is this meant to reflect something that's sort of happening all in an instant in my mind? Or are we talking about stages of life, right? Because think about it, the final few stages are becoming, birth, aging, and death. Like, what? Right? And indeed, some people do, in fact, interpret this as a stages of life thing. This is the sequence that we go through when we go through a lifetime, and then we get reincarnated, right? So we go through a lifetime, it generates karma, it reincarnates. Other people see it as being a mental process that is occurring in an instant, right? So, or very quickly, right? This is something that we go through. Basically, that this is the series of steps that we're going through mentally, right? That cause us to keep up our nonsense, right? To continue being mired in our delusion. And that the birth and death and so on and so forth that we're talking about are not primarily a question of our mortality, that they're not a question of our limited span as human beings, such as they are the sort of multitude of deaths that we have every day as we pass from one moment of consciousness to another. Because, again, we aren't persistent, right? This is the whole point. We have non-self. We have this illusion that all the moments of our day are tied together, right? And that like we are one person. But really what we have is a series of fleeting moments of consciousness, right? That we happen to decide can be stitched together, right? There is a sense in which, of course, right? Like every night you die and you wake up and you're born as a new person, right? Like that is not a trite observation. It's somewhat true. There is a sense of continuity, but that sense of continuity is largely in sort of memory, your memory and the memories of people around you. But your mental state is different, right? Things are different. So there's a lot of interpretive split. Is it in an instant or is this a cycle of life? And there's a great deal of, frankly, interpretive split around sort of the emphasis that people place on the individual links and what they mean. I'm going to give you, I'm going to try anyway, to give you sort of as neutral an interpretation of the 12 links, each of the 12 links as possible. I don't want to skew things doctrinally too much in any direction. Of course, if you are interested in looking into specific Buddhisms, it's interesting to look at this as one of the places where teachers may differ. And frankly, this is something where, even though it's the heart of the Dharma in some sense, right? It's the key. If you can get this, you can get everything, right? If you can understand this one thing, you can theoretically get the whole system. Nevertheless, it's actually quite difficult for people to grasp. Often it's the case that people grasp it in the abstract. They grasp it theoretically, but it's a much trickier thing to try to relate to yourself, like to try to get that sense. Now, to some extent, obviously, that becomes considerably easier if you've developed the kinds of powers of attention that one develops when they are engaged in meditation, which is a big part of the reason why one does it, right? One doesn't just meditate for kicks. Within Buddhism, one meditates to develop the kind of insight and acuity, the ability to look inside of oneself, and the like fine-grained ability to parse your experience so that you can see things happening that normally you would be unable to detect. This is a good example of this. So when the Buddha was sitting under the Bodhi tree, right? When he came to enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, this was a big part of his realization. He saw the 12 links of dependent co-origination and was like, oh, this is the thing that has everybody stuck, right? This is the Ferris wheel that nobody can get off. Ferris wheel, what a strange choice of words. What would be another thing? Merry-go-round? Do people want to get off a merry-go-round? Yes, I believe they do. So this is the merry-go-round. Do we even have merry-go-rounds anymore? Anyway, okay. So this is a merry-go-round that people want to get off. Or they don't even know they're on it, usually. But like in theory, Buddha's like, hey, you're on a merry-go-round. Why don't you get off of that? Okay, so let's go through each of the 12 steps, shall we? Okay, so the first step, ignorance. Okay, so ignorance typically refers to ignorance of two things, right? It's ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, makes sense, but it's also ignorance of the true nature of the self, right? So of course that's somewhat contained in there, but not totally contained in there. So it's ignorance of the Four Noble Truths and it's ignorance of the true nature of the self. Now, notice that ignorance carries with it not like a perfect transformation, not the sense that you're totally transformed, but just the sense that like you don't know at all, right? Your ignorance is ignorance of the Four Noble Truths. It's ignorance of the true nature of the mind. So let's imagine for a second what that state would be like, right? Well, okay, So what would it be to be ignorant of the Four Noble Truths completely? It would mean like not understanding that there is suffering, right? Or not understanding that there is dukkha, not really understanding the true nature of unsatisfactoriness. Well, what does that look like? You know, it looks like people that, you know, don't understand how much of what's happening is occurring in some sense inside of them, right? That things are bad. So people who are just endlessly chasing the thing that's going to solve the problem, right? Okay, so you just don't really know how bad things are. Okay, that would be one. Two is, you know, you're chasing things. You're trying to solve the problem. You're looking for the answer out there, when in fact the answer is in here. There was a very funny skit, comedy skit, which maybe I will post a link to. There's a very funny comedy skit, which is from the 90s by a Canadian sketch comedy group called The Kids in the Hall. And this comedy sketch is, I believe it's called Who's to Blame? And I find this sketch enormously funny because it's actually enormously similar to what people, speaking as like a psychologist, or right, speaking as like a theoretical psychologist, speaking as a psychotherapist, but also speaking as somebody who's very interested in these kinds of conditions of unconsciousness and these conditions of ignorance. I'm very interested in this. So the sketch is like, the boss is at work and he's like looking forward to the big company baseball game. And then his, you know, secretary or his coworker comes in and says, have you looked outside today? And he's like, what? No, I haven't. I don't have time to look out windows. I'm very busy. And she's like, well, it's raining. And he opens the window and it's a torrential downpour and lightning and thunder. And he wheels around and he says to her, who's to blame? Now, why is this interesting? Well, because it's absurd, for one thing. He thinks that there's a company baseball game, but it's raining, the fact that he would have noticed if he had looked outside. And immediately he looks for somebody to blame. Who's to blame when the weather is bad? What does that even mean, right? What would it even mean? But the answer, right, he goes looking for the answer. Who's to blame? You know what? In fact, I will just post this sketch. I will post a link to the sketch and watch it. But that sketch basically is a good example of the kind of mind state that people who have not yet encountered the second noble truth are in, right? They're looking for external things to satisfy them. This is going to solve the problem, right? But they're also looking for who's to blame, the external problem out there. Oh, that's the issue. I want to make that go away. This is going to help. I'll bring this close, right? The answer to escaping their suffering apparently is external objects. When in fact, point is, no, it's about addressing this internal process in which you're trapped, okay? So to not recognize the third noble truth is not realize there's a way out. So let's say that you were ignorant just of the third and fourth. You knew the first two. Well, that's a terrible state to be in, but it is a state that lots of people are in, actually. You can recognize that you're suffering, and you can recognize that the source of your suffering is that you hate things and you crave things, right? You can recognize in some sense, you're like, I wish I didn't have these feelings. I like this, I hate that, I'm embarrassed, I'm afraid, I'm frustrated, right? I'm fixated, I'm excited, right? You can recognize it's like, oh, the issue is this. People do. So you get this very often when people are sort of in the aftermath, the wreckage after a particularly bad breakup, where maybe there's been some like obsessive stuff, and afterwards they're like, I can't do this to myself again, right? I have to like not get so caught up with somebody. You hear that from people a lot. Okay, so they've recognized that there is suffering, that it's unnecessary, that they're causing it to themselves. And they've recognized that the cause of their suffering is this craving, that they want something, so on and so forth. But what they haven't recognized yet is the third noble truth, right? There is a way out, right? There is a way out. There is nirvana. There is the possibility of escaping from this predicament. They don't know that yet, right? And so often people not knowing that will continue to suffer needlessly. They will get caught up in things and so on and so forth. Okay, so fine. But what if you knew the first three noble truths, but not the last noble truth, right? So you know that there's suffering, and you know that it's your tanha, your craving, your clinging, right? And you even know that it's possible to break that cycle. Maybe you've seen it, right? You've seen somebody get out of it, but you don't know what to do. What do you do, right? The fourth noble truth, here's what you do, right? Here's what you do. This is the way to do it. But also, this is what it will look like when you have done it, right? It's both. Here's how to do it, but here's what it will look like when you have done it, both. Okay, so ignorance is ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, but it's also ignorance of the nature of the self, which is to say that the self is empty. So the idea, right, that as long as you've got this like fixed commitment to you, that fixation on the ego, that idea that it's like it's about you and your super special permanence and right, your immortal soul and so on and so forth. As long as you're doing that, right, then also within the Buddhist framework, you're in a state of ignorance. So you got to have both. You have to have some intuition that you are not, you're not maybe as quite as permanent as you think, and you're not as solid as you think, you're not as eternal as you think. But also, you have to have knowledge of the Four Noble Truths. Now, this is knowledge. It's not, you have to have it perfected, but you have to kind of know about it, right? Otherwise, you're going to get stuck, or you're going to remain stuck. Okay. 1, ignorance. 2, mental formations. So mental formations are impulses. They're your impulses to action. They're the things that motivate you towards action, okay? So this is sort of traditionally in the literature where they claim karma emerges, right? Karma starts emerging with this impulse to action. We move and it has sort of effects. It creates karmic effects because we're caught up. One very apt metaphor for the mental formations, right? These kinds of impulses, these actions, these old habits, in a sense, is that it gets usefully compared to a bowman who shoots arrows straight up into the air, right? So a bowman shoots arrows straight up in the air. And when you do that as a bowman, right, sooner or later, an arrow comes down and hits you in the head. Like you're going to get hit. So every time you shoot one of these arrows, you shoot it straight up. And of course, it comes back down and maybe it misses you. But sooner or later, you're going to get hit. And this is sort of the boomerang effect, as they talk about with karma, right? It's going to come back around to bite you. So step 1, ignorance. Step 2, mental formations, impulses to action. Okay, step 3, consciousness. Now, this is one of these places where in translation, again, we have a hard time with this because it makes you kind of scratch your head. It's like, well, wait a minute, consciousness? We have to have codependent or dependent co-origination to have consciousness? Like, isn't consciousness like important and good? Okay, so the thing is, we're not talking about general consciousness. What we're talking about is the specific consciousness of like an object in the world making contact with one of your 6 faculties, one of your skandhas, one of your heaps, right? One of your senses, rather. So you have, you know, the 5 regular senses, right? Eyes, ears, nose, touch, and taste, right? And then also number 6, as we discussed, mind, right? When one of those things makes contact in a specific kind of way with an object in the outside world, that's what's called consciousness in this set. So it's not the broad sense of consciousness, not kind of like expansive awareness, but rather just this very limited, like, boop, it's connected up with one of the 6 senses. Boop. Okay. Boop. Okay, next, name and form. Name and form is where the skandhas get into the mix. So it's the 6 senses for consciousness, then the skandhas get into the mix. The skandhas, the heaps, right, which compose you. So name and form is when it suddenly gets like concretized. So you can see that there is like a sequence of things that's happening here. First, there is ignorance, then mental formations, there's impulses to action, then you get consciousness, right? Something outside connecting with one of the 6 faculties, and then name and form, right? Okay, next, the 6 sense organs get into the mix, right? And this is specifically like the activation of those 6 senses. And then 6, contact, okay? Contact, a sharp moment of contact. 7, feeling, which is like a recognition experience, the feeling you get towards something, okay? 8, craving, which we've encountered before. 9, clinging, which we've encountered before. 10, becoming, the unfolding of this. 11, birth, 12, aging and death. Birth and aging and death all run together on one quick thing. And as you saw in the diagram, of course, it's a cycle. So after aging and death, we come back around to ignorance. Now, the first time I ever encountered this, I thought it was incredibly interesting, in part because the sequence that you hear them listed is not actually the sequence that they run in, which I found quite confusing at the time. But also because there was 10 steps before birth. And then it was just like birth, aging, and death. It's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. There's a lot happening here before we're even getting to birth, right? Which, if we take as a lifespan thing, is like, whoa, so this is everything that happens before birth. But if we take it as a psychological loop, even then it's like, wait a minute. So this is all the stuff that's like the background processing. Yeah, that's right. Like, this is the set of things happening so quickly for you, okay? The set of processes is happening so quickly that it occurs before anything even enters on the scene. It is, as we have said, automatic, basically, but it can be interrupted. If you could disrupt, if you could break any one of these 12 steps, any one of these links, the process stops. If you could break any one of them, right? But it's hard enough to even see them. These things are occurring basically so quickly in your head, right? They're happening so fast that you're mostly not even aware of them. And you're mostly, frankly, just caught up in your projections, right? In the projections that you're sort of having, that you're bringing to things. Okay. So let's unpack the order a little bit so that we have some sense of that, okay? So as I mentioned, okay, the first stage, okay, is steps 1, 2, and 3. Ignorance, mental formations, and consciousness. Okay, so we unpacked that already. Ignorance, relatively straightforward, right? Mental formations, the impulses to action, the impulses to action. You can think of this to some extent, right? When you think about, you know, how past experiences have had an effect on you, right? It's in some sense, you're like latent material, right? And you can think about consciousness in that sense in some way too. Like, there are lots of things, for instance, okay, that you know, but that are not presently in your mind, right? There are lots of things that you know that are not presently in your mind. I could ask you all kinds of facts, for instance, and you would be able to answer them even though you're not thinking about them right now. I'm trying to think. What was the name? No, is that too old? What was the name of the vampire in Twilight? You know, I never even read those books, nor did I see the films, and I know the answer. The answer is Edward. So, you know, there are questions that I can ask you, and maybe many of you are like, who? Yeah, the point is, right, there are all kinds of questions I could ask you propositionally, and you would know the answer, even though you're not thinking about them right now, right? It's latent. Likewise, there are all kinds of abilities you have that you're not currently employing, and you're not even really currently aware of, but they're latent in you. If you know how to ride a bicycle, most of you, I assume, do. If you know how to ride a bicycle, if you suddenly encountered a bicycle and had to ride it, that knowledge is latent. It's not present with you now, but it would come up, right? You would just get on and you would have that expressed. It is latent knowledge. All these things have made impressions on you, right? For you to know that fact that I asked you, you know the answer to, you had to previously be exposed to it. It had to make an impression on you, right? Previously. Likewise, for you to be able to see the bicycle and be able to get on the bicycle, you had to previously make impressions on yourself. You had to learn, right? And learning is like making a series of impressions that create this latency, right? So this is the idea. When you have these impulses and actions, mental formations and consciousness, it's all the stuff from your past, right? You are conditioned. You're conditioned, right? You're conditioned to certain kinds of responses. But notice that doesn't just apply to facts and skills. It also applies to judgments. So, for instance, let's say that you're the kind of person who hates dogs, right? Terrified of dogs. A lot of people are terrified of dogs, a fair few people. And most of those people have had a bad experience with a dog. Now, it doesn't matter at some level that, you know, a person might have been bitten by a dog when they were 6, and possibly then their parents were terrified of dogs or whatever, but maybe they were bitten by dogs, and so they just don't like dogs. Dogs make them nervous, they scare them, right? Now, are all dogs likely to bite you? No, of course not. Of course they're not. But are you likely to overgeneralize the category? Yes, yes you are. You're likely going to have a bias in this respect, right? So it's created an impression on you, and that has changed the way that you respond to things. That too is present in this transition from mental formations through to consciousness, right? There is an automaticity to it. You can see how there's an automaticity to it, right? Same thing. You might have like a conditioned taste for something. I'm trying to think of a good example. I mean, addictions are interesting examples, of course, but they typically tend to be a lot more complicated than that. Okay, let's say that you always had a particular kind of food growing up during a particular holiday, right? There was like some food that your family always made. And now when that time of year comes around, you develop like an incredible, like, oh my God, I really want this food, this particular food. Well, that would be a kind of conditioned response, right? The context is there. And so your conditioned response, your sort of impulse to action is impressed upon you. You've acquired it, right? So that's the kind of like pulling towards version. And then of course there's like the dogs, the pushing away. So you can see that the various experiences that you've had because of the cycle have impressed this stuff on you to the point where it's automatic. You're not choosing to want that particular food in the holidays. It just comes up for you and you feel it. You're not choosing to dislike dogs, right? You're not making an assessment about dogs. You're not like working it out about dogs. You just don't like them. You just have a reaction, right? Okay, so first 3 steps: ignorance, mental formations, and consciousness. Something out there touches something in here. Okay, then we skip over. What's the next step? Step 8, craving. Okay, so remember, there are 3 forms of craving, right? The sort of craving to get things that we want, and the craving to keep things that we have, basically, and then the craving to make things stop or go away, and a little bit like the craving for self-destruction under certain conditions. Sometimes things get bad enough that we in fact are craving non-being in that sense, that kind of like, I'm really tired of playing the game and I'm done now. Everybody feels that way sometimes. I may have said this when we were talking about this in the week, but a thing that I always say to my clients when we're starting is everybody is always very nervous about this. And I say, I need to be clear with you, right? Like there's a line that I have with a client about what constitutes suicidality, like whether or not this is something we need to worry about. I said, when people come in and they're like, I hate my job, or I hate school, or I hate my family, or whatever, and I kind of want to die, I'm not worried about that. Everybody wants to die sometimes. If on the other hand, they're like, I don't know, saving up pills, or they have a plan, or, they're like, I know when I'm going to do it. That's a different question. That's concrete action. But everybody wants to die sometimes because like life is a pain. It's tiring, right? Sometimes I want to die. I don't know if I brought this up before, but I've told many people, including my clients, like there are a lot of days when I've been sleep deprived and I've had to take the subway really early. And I hate taking the subway really early when I'm tired. And sometimes I'm just there and I'm like, forget this, like I'm done. And then sometimes I have a slightly more rational response and I say, no, I don't want to die. Maybe I'll just fake my own death. And then I can like sneak away and start a whole new life, unburdened by all of the nonsense that's stuck onto my current life. Everybody has those fantasies. Like everybody occasionally has fantasies about killing other people. Well, not everybody, but statistically a vast majority of people, as we've discovered. So the point is, craving, right? The sort of 4th link is step 8. I know it's confusing. The 4th link is step 8, craving, where craving is this really specific thing. It's 3 kind of forms of craving. Okay. Step 9, clinging, right? Grasping and clinging. Okay. Okay, and then we're back onto the other side. Then name and form. So the skandhas binding into this, name and form, okay? Then the 6 sense organs get into the mix. Then contact. right? All of that preceded contact. Like basically nothing has happened. Now there's contact, right? Contact between our mind and the thing that is perpetuating, right? And then finally there's feeling. And feeling is that moment of recognition, of experience, right? You're suddenly having like an actual impulse, something that you would recognize as a conscious event. You have a feeling about the thing. Okay, and then having cycled through that, we get to the last three stages, and it's becoming, birth, aging, and death. Well, what do these three things mean? It means that, we have all this preparatory stuff lining us up, and then suddenly it's becoming and things move into a sequence of time, and then it ends out. But notice that aging and death is just like the falling off of the process. Like it's gone through this whole thing and it kind of like decays and rots and dies. But is that the end? No, it's the start of the cycle. And we go around again. And then we go through it and we go around again. And then we go through it and we go around again. If you happen to believe this particular set of sort of Buddhist claims, and there are things to quibble with here, obviously, right? Like perhaps if we all had the kind of powers of concentration and attention, which were cultivated by the historical Buddha and perhaps by some of his followers, right? Then it would be very easy for us to look inside of ourselves and discern these things. It is true that when you develop a regular and sort of practiced meditation habit, right? When you're doing meditation regularly and you start to deepen your practice, right? It is kind of amazing the things that you catch. You start to catch gaps that you didn't catch before. So I mentioned this one before when I was meditating a lot and I caught that gap with my father, right? And it was like the scene in The Matrix. He puts his hand up, the bullets come in, they stop, and he looks at them, and then he just says, no. That basically is the power to see the gaps in the links, right? But normally it's all just happening so fast, we don't even detect it. So maybe if we all had those powers of concentration and attention and awareness, we would be able to look inside and it would be obvious to us. Maybe. Now, is this the only description you can give of this, these particular 12 steps in this particular shape? I got to admit, I doubt it. Because each of these steps shades into each other in an important way. That's one of the things that makes it confusing, but it's intended to convey a flow, right? One thing flows into the next. And so when you're looking at the steps and you're like, oh my God, like what's the distinction between this and this? Well, I think that is somewhat intentional, right? They're intended to flow into each other. They're intended to flow into each other because there is this fluid, cyclical, repetitious, right? So at this stage, don't worry about it too much if you don't absolutely nail down your understanding, but try to go through a few times and see if you can connect your mind up with it. See if you can get a sense based on this and read around it a little bit, but see if you can get a sense of what is happening there, what is working. Now, I want to point out one important thing, and then I'm going to jump over to the kind of explanatory side just a little bit. I previously mentioned that the traditional formulation of the Eightfold Path, right, is the eight-spoked wheel. And, I mentioned that there's a reason in part that it's depicted as a wheel, and that's that to show that it's not a sequence, right, in some sense, that each of the aspects of the Eightfold Path is sort of equally important, right? They're all important, that you need them all to have that shape. But there's something else about it that's very important and interesting, okay? And it's that it's a wheel. When you get it working the right way, what does a wheel do? It rolls. This is the great invention of the wheel. I mean, it is an invention, right? And what an invention. What an amazing invention, the wheel, right? We don't really see the wheel in nature. We see feet, we see wings, we see fins, we see lots of different flagella, interesting forms of locomotion, but not the wheel. The wheel is a fascinating idea, really. Okay, so it rolls. What does that mean? It means that it has like a self-perpetuating quality to it, right? It rolls along, it spins on its own. It is not coincidental, I would propose to you, that the fact that the Eightfold Path is a wheel and the fact that the cycle of dependent co-origination, the 12 links, are a cycle, that's not coincidental. Why? Because the Eightfold Path is intended basically, okay, to counter this system. So you can imagine one of them is spinning clockwise and the one that you're building is spinning the other way. I have mentioned many times this metaphor that, we're not like a rock, we're not like a mountain, we're more like a tornado. We're more like a whirlpool in the river, right? So the water comes along, and in this particular place, right, here it is, a whirlpool. You can see all the leaves trapped in it, right? But the water is always flowing through. That's what we're like. We're a process, a whirlpool. But I want you to think for a second. If you have a whirlpool moving one way and a whirlpool moving the other way, and they combine, what happens? They cancel each other out. So when you have two whirlpools moving the opposite way, they come together and they cancel each other out, right? So I'm going to propose to you that it is not coincidental that the Eightfold Path is a wheel. It's a wheel because you are trying to build something that spins on its own to counter this thing that spins and spins and spins and keeps you trapped, right, on the merry-go-round. Keeps you trapped on the merry-go-round. Okay. Talking a little bit about Western psychology and linking this in. One of the things that's really interesting about trying to kind of grasp, right, the notion of the 12 links of dependent co-origination is looking at it both in terms of, the past, because there are sort of things that have had impact on you, but also looking at it in terms of the various kinds of causes that are making you doing what you're doing, right? The idea that in some important sense, you're not really operating with free will. You don't have agency. You're just reacting because of conditioned stuff. You're not really experiencing consciousness for the most part. You're just reacting. It's just reflexes, right? Now, in a way, this is not so different than what you do in sort of long-form psychodynamic analysis, right? Psychodynamic therapy. Very often it's the case that, the work in therapy starts with some examination of the past. Yes, you start by looking at current circumstances, of course, but then you start to look into the past. What do you ask about? You ask about family of origin, right? You find out about the family structure. What's the situation with your family of origin, right? And your place in it, and your links. You might even go back further, right? Grandparents, great-grandparents, right? You might look at other aspects of intersectionality, other aspects of their identity. And those are all different contributing factors. Some of that is going to be things like religion. Some of it is going to be things like ethnicity or nationality, right? And these are factors that go further back than the individual. They're older influences that continue to feed forward, right? And they carry with them certain kinds of things, right? There is such a thing as a cultural delusion. In fact, every culture has them in one way or another. Cultures have ways of seeing things. And sometimes a culture's way of seeing something is counterproductive. There are such a thing as cultural biases. There are whole cultures, right, that have strong biases against certain things and indirections against things. And those things, of course, roll forward to impact on you. So when you start in on psychodynamic psychotherapy, you're looking into the past to a great extent, right? What brings you in? Well, when you ask somebody that question, they're going to tell you a story. Some of it is going to be about how they feel now, but a lot of it is going to be about what led up to that. Well, there was this situation, and also you have to understand that when I was a kid, and when you start unraveling this stuff, you typically are going to turn up more and more patterns. You're going to see that this is an echo of this. Oh, I see. So your relationship with this woman is like your relationship with your mother, is a classic, right? There's a reason that Freud settled on that. There are a lot of reasons, but that's a classic. And that kind of stuff really does turn up, right? Your relationship with your parent is echoed in your relationship with others, right? You look for these patterns, these echoes. You look for the ways that things have imprinted on you so that you now automatically react. So why are you afraid of dogs, right? Well, when I was a kid, a dog attacked me, and I was like, okay, so that's that particular dog, but why are you afraid of other dogs, right? You start to unpack this kind of thing. What brought you here? You're looking at the past, okay? And in a very similar way, there's an aspect, right, of the 12 links of dependent co-origination that stretches into the past because it's tracking the progress of karma. Here's how your karma, here's how the rolling effect, here's how the wave of what you've been doing brought you to here, right? And you have to kind of trace backwards to get some sense of it. There's an interesting aspect to this. Freud once famously said that the role of the role of psychotherapy, or psychoanalysis, as he would have said, was to convert neurotic misery into common unhappiness, or ordinary unhappiness. So it was to convert neurotic misery into ordinary unhappiness. As I've mentioned, I'm a neo-Jungian, so I set the bar a little higher. I feel like we should be able to convert maybe common unhappiness into, at the very least, common happiness, and possibly a few instances of exceptional happiness. But, you know, Buddhism is making a bigger kind of promise, right? Buddhism is promising to free us from neurotic misery basically entirely. And frankly, to get us out of most ordinary unhappiness as well. It's a promise of liberation. Okay, so you start by looking at the past when you start looking at these things. And there's an effect that that has for a lot of people. It puts them in a tight spot. And this is not dissimilar to the impact, I think, that the 12 links of dependent co-origination have. Because the tight spot is this. It removes your sense that you have been acting freely. It reduces your sense of your own agency. It makes you feel like more of a robot. Because you start to see all of these things that have influenced you, that made you do what you're doing, made you do. And this is the thing, it's very easy to get swept up in that. It's very easy to look at all of these impacts and conditions and traumas and whatever, and then to take from that and say, well, so I had no choice, I can't do any differently. Now, to look at your past and say, wow, I really understand how those things affected me and got me to this situation, that's one thing. But therapy always, pretty much always, eventually grounds out in the here and now. In the here and now. Because although you start by unpacking the past and all the different karmic influences or memory influences, conditions, et cetera, right, that may have impacted on you, you can't do anything about the past. You can only do things here and now. The here and now is where those things are operating. If you have no memory, no impression in the present moment of an event in the past, it's like it didn't happen. If an event happened, nobody remembers it and it leaves no trace, who cares? It's like it didn't happen, right? This, in fact, accounts sometimes for why the mind plays tricks on itself. It forgets things in an attempt occasionally, right, to make things not happen. But, you know, the point is, you eventually move into the here and now. It's not, ultimately speaking, about what happened to you in your childhood. It's about how things are affecting you now, right here, right now. And right here and right now are the place where your agency is operating. Now, I hesitate to say free will, because that's like a philosophically loaded term, right? And there's something about it that also, of course, keys into this idea of like the eternal and immortal soul. And I think that that's kind of problematic too in the context. But we'll say agency, right? Moving in a way that is sort of in some sense aligned with goals, moving towards the good, moving in the ways that you want rather than in this completely automatic cycle, right? And I've mentioned before that I don't think that it's the case that we always want to maximize our agency. The more we have a sense of agency, the more we have a sense of responsibility. And sometimes it can be really crushing, okay? So sometimes we don't want it. Sometimes we want things to be mechanical. Sometimes we want things to be deterministic. Sometimes we want to be a robot a bit, okay? But it's also the case that if we move too much in the direction of determinism, then we feel trapped. We don't get to choose anything. We feel like a robot, right? We don't get to make any of our own choices. And it's imperative for us to break free from this whole thing, that we have some sense of agency. We really can do something. Once we have this information, we can, right? We can sort of put a stick into the 12 links and knock it out. Or better yet, we can build the Eightfold Path as a wheel to come and deal with this and break it up. So this transition, okay, from the past, the concern with the past, the unraveling the past, all of that matters. Of course it does, right? But ultimately, it's about the here and now. So that is a bit of a brief overview. We're going to look more specifically at some of the stuff as we're going forward, okay? Don't worry too much if you're finding the causal order confusing. As I mentioned, right, there is speculation, in fact, among sort of Buddhist scholars and teachers, interpreters in different schools about why the Buddha gave these things in one order, but they're operating in a different order. And there's disagreement about that, right? Like anything, humans are going to interpret it. We love arguing about stuff, and we're going to come up with interpretations. I mean, as I mentioned, even on things that the Buddha really specifically decided not to answer questions about, that didn't stop lots of people from coming up with stuff about it, right? So there's lots of disagreement about this. I think, personally, and I don't know if this is completely deliberate, but here's the thing. The Buddhists use a number of kind of tricks to try to make their stuff catchy. So they're big on numbered lists, right? The 3 this, the 4 that, the 7 this, the 8 that, the 12 this, the 51 that, right? I've mentioned this, numbered lists. Numbered lists are one of these ways that you can, make something a little catchier. It also helps if it rhymes, right? So like Buddha, Dharma, Sangha doesn't quite rhyme, but there's like, it's like 3 and it's a little, it's got some pop, right? So it's a little catchy. But numbered lists are one of the big ways that they do it, right? They have these numbered lists. But there are other methods of catchiness. And the one that I'm thinking of, this is totally speculative, but I'm pitching it out there anyway. Sometimes if something doesn't make sense, it's much more likely to catch our attention than if it does. So this is a basic rule. So I worked as a writer, right? I've written a lot of fiction. And of course I do role playing, and so I'm aware of this. And I'm very aware of how compelling it can be when something doesn't fit for people. One of the big mistakes you see, frankly, lots of TV shows make is that they set up a delicious mystery, and then eventually they run out of ideas, and so they answer the question. And it's like, oh. And the answer is never going to be particularly interesting, but also they can't just string you along forever, right? That's a real tightrope. It's hard for them to do. So a good example of this, real quick, okay, is the Shakespeare play Hamlet. Okay, so Hamlet, if you're not familiar, Hamlet is basically the same story as The Lion King, which is to say the Lion King is Hamlet. But Hamlet is a Shakespeare play, and what's the plot line? There is this young prince of Denmark, Hamlet, and he's not that young, actually, he's like 40. And he comes back from university because his dad dies, and he gets back and finds out that his father is dead and his mother is marrying his uncle. Gross. Okay. And then basically, like, he's back, and promptly some guards show up and they're like, there's a ghost out there. And he goes out and there's this ghost, and it's his father. And his father says, your uncle murdered me. And Hamlet says, holy crap. And his father says, avenge my death, avenge my death, and vanishes. Okay, then Hamlet spends so much of the play vacillating, giving speeches, pretending to be crazy, setting up a fake play, driving his lover nuts until she completes suicide, going on pirate adventures, etc., before he finally decides to do something. Now, the poet and sort of English critic, T.S. Eliot, once remarked that he believed Hamlet was an artistic failure. Why? Well, because Hamlet is based on an earlier play. Okay, it's based on an earlier play. Like much of Shakespeare's work, he borrowed a lot of material. The difference is that in the earlier versions of the play that Shakespeare bases Hamlet off, it's very clear why he doesn't immediately take revenge. There's like a bunch of very good reasons for him to do that. He has to be sneaky because there are reasons. And Shakespeare deliberately takes those reasons out. Just takes them out of the plot. Now, what's the effect of this? The effect of this is it's very hard to understand why Hamlet is doing what he's doing. And consequently, it has probably made Hamlet the most famous Shakespeare play. Why? Because we don't know why he's doing what he's doing. He's doing a bunch of sophisticated stuff. There's presumably a reason. What's the reason? Why is it happening? So I have no idea if the Buddha intended that to be the case, but I think that some of the catchiness of this is the fact that it's very hard to understand, and that signals to us a lot of the time, right? Things that are easy to understand are cheap. That's basically what we tend to believe, right? Good things require some effort. So I think that this degree of inconsistency actually is a little bit helpful, trying to figure this out, you have to like do some acrobatics. And that's annoying, frankly, a little bit as a student, but take the value of it. In order to make sense of this, you're going to have to work it through your mind. So go through, right? Read about it. You should be in, the papers and the text that I recommended, but also you can go through my explanation and go through and try to square it off, right? The order of the 12 is not the actual order in which they occur, and try to connect yourself with it. Try to get some sense of it. What does this mean? What does it mean? What does it mean for you? Okay. And we'll come back around to this, but see if you can get your head wrapped around it. Okay. And next week is reading week, so there won't be class and there won't be office hours. And I hope that if you don't take off the whole week, which maybe you can't, because God knows why we don't have spring break and fall break like they would in the States. We have reading week. I sincerely hope that you take time off. And if you can't take off the whole week, try to take at least 3 days. Like, get yourself some rest and some play. Those things are important. And I'll see you guys in 2 weeks.